What's a lie your parents told you that ruined your life? I was looking through my best friend Paula's phone when I saw a Venmo payment that made my stomach drop. Monthly payment, Ava Roll sent to P. Preston. $2,500. My name is Ava. Paula's last name is Preston. I scrolled up with shaking hands. Payment after payment, going back years. Ava Friend Services. Monthly Ava engagement. Ava birthday party appearance. Thousands of dollars from an account named Jessie Sullivan. My mother. Paula returned from the bathroom. I held up her phone, the payment screen still visible. Her face went white. Around us, our other friends continued their brunch conversations, unaware that my entire world was crumbling. Ava, I can explain. You're being paid to be my friend? The table went silent. Aubrey and Savannah exchanged glances I'd never noticed before. Guilty glances. Skylar suddenly became very interested in her mimosa. They all knew. It's not what it looks like, Paula said, reaching for her phone. But I was already pulling up more transactions. Aubrey Rodriguez, Savannah Park, Skylar Williams, all receiving monthly payments from my mother, all for Ava-related services. 5 years of payments, 5 years of friendship. All of you? My voice cracked. Your mom contacted us through the agency, Aubrey said quietly. We're all actors. Struggling actors who needed steady work. I thought about every moment. Paula holding my hair when I was sick. Aubrey celebrating when I got promoted. Savannah crying with me when my ex cheated. Skylar planning elaborate birthday surprises. All of it. Paid, performed. The crying, the laughing, every single moment. The emotions were real, Savannah insisted. We grew to actually care. Because you were paid to. I stood up, knocking over my water glass. The restaurant staff stared, but I didn't care. 5 years of inside jokes, shared secrets, adventures, the group chat that kept me sane, the friends who got me through my depression, all hired by my mother. Ava, please. Paula grabbed my arm. Yes, it started as a job. But we genuinely what? Like me? How could you possibly know? You were contractually obligated to spend time with me. I thought about every insecurity I'd shared, every vulnerability. They'd probably reported it all back to my mother. Were their responses scripted? Their advice rehearsed? When I'd sobbed about feeling like nobody really knew me, were they fighting not to laugh at the irony? My phone rang. Mom. How long have you known? She asked immediately. Of course they'd already told her. How could you do this to me? You were so lonely after college. So withdrawn. You needed friends and weren't making any. I just wanted to help. By hiring actors? By making my entire social life a lie? They're good girls. They care about you now. They care about their paychecks. I hung up and looked at the 4 women I'd considered my closest friends. My bridesmaids-to-be. The people I'd planned to have in my life forever. They sat there like actresses waiting for their next cue. Show me your contracts, I demanded. Paula pulled up a document on her phone. Professional Friend Services, LLC. I was listed as Client 447. There were performance metrics, response time requirements, mandatory weekly interactions, penalty clauses for breaking character. Breaking character, I read aloud. So this is all character work to you? Not anymore, Skylar said. That's what we've been trying to tell your mom. We want to terminate the contracts. Be real friends. Real friends? I laughed bitterly. How? You know everything about me, and I know nothing real about any of you. Not even your real names, probably. Our names are real, Aubrey said softly. But our backstories aren't, Paula admitted. My dead father? Alive in Miami? Aubrey's struggling artist story? She's from money? Savannah's ex who traumatized her? Never existed. We crafted personalities that would mesh with yours. I felt physically sick. Every late-night conversation where we'd bonded over shared traumas. Every moment I'd felt understood. Every time I'd been grateful to find my people. All manufactured. Your engagement party last month, I said, looking at Savannah. Was that real? Her silence was answer enough. Even her fiancé was probably an actor. We want out, Paula said desperately. We've told your mom repeatedly, but she threatens to sue us for breach of contract. Says she'll destroy our careers. So you just kept lying to me? We didn't know how to tell you. Hey, Ava, your mom pays us to hang out with you, but we actually like you now? How do you say that? I grabbed my purse to leave. 4 phones immediately buzzed. I didn't have to look to know it was my mother, penalizing them for letting me discover the truth. Wait, Aubrey called out. Check your mother's study. She has files on all of us. On you. This goes deeper than just hiring friends. What do you mean? Aubrey leaned forward and her voice dropped low. She said my mother has files on everything. Psychological reports about me, strategies for keeping other people away from me, records of every conversation I've ever had with them. She said it's not just about paying for friends, but about controlling my whole life. My hands went numb, and I had to set down my water glass before I dropped it. The idea that my mother had been documenting me like some kind of experiment made my skin crawl. I stood up fast enough that my chair scraped loudly against the floor. I grabbed my purse and walked toward the exit without looking back at any of them. Behind me, I heard Paula call my name, but I kept walking. The hostess asked if everything was okay, and I just pushed past her into the parking lot. My phone started buzzing in my hand the second I got outside, text after text lighting up the screen. I silenced it and unlocked my car with shaking fingers. I sat in the driver's seat and tried to breathe normally, but my chest felt tight. The phone kept buzzing even on silent, the screen flashing with notifications. I looked down and saw the group chat we'd had for 5 years was exploding with messages. Paula sent 3 long paragraphs about how the job became real to her, how she actually cares about me now even though it started as acting. Aubrey sent screenshots of emails, dozens of them, all sent to my mother's address. The subject line said things like, "Request to disclose truth to client," and ethical concerns regarding continuation. I scrolled through them and saw Aubrey had been begging my mother to let her tell me the truth for over a year. Savannah wrote that she's been seeing a therapist twice a week because the guilt was eating her alive. She said she wanted to quit, but my mother threatened to sue her and ruin her career. Skylar sent a message saying she tried to quit 3 separate times, and my mother increased her payment each time to make her stay. I read every message while sitting frozen in the parking lot. Other cars pulled in and out around me, but I couldn't move. The messages kept coming, all 4 of them trying to explain, trying to make me understand, but understanding didn't change what they'd done. After an hour of sitting there, I finally started the car. My hands were steadier now, replaced by cold determination. If Aubrey was right about the files, I needed to see them before my mother had a chance to hide anything. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward the suburbs where my mother lives. The drive took 30 minutes, and I spent the whole time thinking about what I might find. My mother's house looked exactly the same as always when I pulled into the driveway. Perfect lawn, perfect flowers, perfect exterior hiding whatever mess was inside. I used my key to let myself in through the front door. The house was quiet and empty. My mother was probably still trying to reach the 4 women, trying to do damage control. I walked straight to her home study, a room she always discouraged me from entering. She'd say it was boring, just bills and paperwork, nothing interesting. The door was unlocked when I tried the handle. I stepped inside and looked around at the neat desk, the filing cabinets, the bookshelf. Then I noticed the small security camera mounted in the corner near the ceiling. I'd never paid attention to it before, always assumed it was part of the house security system, but now I realized my mother was probably watching me right this second. My stomach turned, but I didn't leave. Let her watch. Let her see me find out the truth. I went to her desk and started opening drawers. The first 2 had normal things, pens and notebooks and old tax documents. The 3rd drawer was locked, but the key was in the top drawer, which seemed careless until I realized my mother never expected me to go looking. I unlocked it and pulled out a thick binder. The cover had a label that read, Client 447 Ava Sullivan, with the Professional Friend Services LLC logo printed at the top. I opened it and saw contracts with all 4 women's signatures. Payment schedules going back 5 years. Performance reviews written by my mother rating each woman on different metrics like responsiveness, emotional authenticity, and ability to mirror my moods. There were detailed profiles of all 4 women showing their real backgrounds next to the fake stories they told me. Paula's father wasn't dead. He was alive and living in Miami. Aubrey wasn't a struggling artist from a poor family. She came from serious money. Savannah's traumatic ex-boyfriend never existed at all. Everything they'd told me about themselves was crafted specifically to connect with my life experiences. I kept flipping through pages and found scripted conversation starters organized by category. There was a whole section labeled Romantic Breakup Support, with suggested phrases and emotional tone guidelines. Another section called Career Setback Comfort, with response patterns they should follow. A third section titled Birthday Celebration Protocols, with specific instructions for making me feel special and valued. I realized that so many of our deep conversations, the ones where I felt truly understood, were probably following these scripts. The spontaneous heart-to-hearts that meant everything to me were carefully planned performances. In the back of the binder, I found printed photos from parties and trips we took together. There was the beach weekend from 2 years ago, the Vegas trip for my birthday, the camping adventure where we got lost and laughed until we cried. Each photo had notes written in my mother's handwriting in the margins. Next to a photo of Paula and me laughing at brunch, she wrote, Paula, increase humor here, client responding well to levity. Next to a picture of Aubrey hugging me at my promotion party, she wrote, Aubrey, mirror Ava's mood more closely. She needs reflection, not cheerleading. Next to a shot of Savannah with her arm around me, she wrote, Savannah, physical affection working well, increase frequency. My mother had been directing their performances like a movie, giving notes on how to play their parts better. I found a timeline document tucked into a pocket at the very back. It showed every major event in my life over the past 5 years with dates and notes. My graduation, my first job, my promotions, my relationship with Blake. But what made my blood run cold was seeing that my mother contacted the agency exactly 2 weeks before Blake broke up with me. There were notes in her handwriting that said, preparing support infrastructure, and ensuring emotional stability during planned relationship disruption. The words suggested she knew the breakup was coming. Or worse, that she somehow made it happen. Had she contacted Blake? Paid him to leave me? Interfered with my relationship so I'd be vulnerable and need the support of my paid friends? My chest got tight and I couldn't catch my breath right. Classic panic attack symptoms, the kind I hadn't felt in years. I pulled out my phone to call Emma, my college roommate, the one person I thought existed before all of this. But I stopped with my finger over her name. How did I know Emma was real? How did I know anyone in my life wasn't hired by my mother? I hung up before the call connected and sat down hard in my mother's desk chair. Everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie. Every friendship, every connection, every moment of feeling understood or cared for. All of it could be fake. All of it could be another performance orchestrated by my mother. I looked around the study at the filing cabinets and wondered what else was in here. What other parts of my life had she controlled and documented? The camera in the corner blinked its little red light and I stared back at it, wondering if she was watching me fall apart right now. The front door opened downstairs and I heard my mother calling my name. Her footsteps came up the stairs fast but not panicked, like she already knew exactly where I was and what I'd found. She appeared in the study doorway and her face looked resigned instead of surprised, which told me everything I needed to know about that security camera blinking in the corner. She'd been watching me discover her files this whole time and drove straight home to deal with it. She walked in and sat down in the chair across from her desk, not trying to take the binder from my hands or make excuses. Her posture was too calm, too prepared, like she'd been rehearsing this conversation in her head for years just in case I ever found out. She started talking in this measured tone about how I was desperately lonely after college, barely leaving my apartment for weeks at a time, and she just wanted to help me build a social life since I wasn't making friends on my own. The words sounded practiced and smooth, like lines from a script she'd memorized. She kept saying she did it because she loved me and couldn't stand watching me suffer alone, but every justification felt hollow when I was sitting there holding proof of how she'd controlled every friendship I thought I had. I cut her off and asked directly what Aubrey meant about this going deeper than just hiring friends. My mother's face got tight and she tried to change the subject, talking about how the girls really did care about me now and how that's what mattered. I held up the timeline document with all the notes about Blake and demanded to know if she interfered with my relationship. She opened her mouth but no words came out, and that silence was worse than any confession. Instead of waiting for an answer, I started taking photos of every page in the binder with my phone. My mother said I shouldn't do that those were private files, but she didn't actually try to stop me physically. I photographed the contracts, the payment schedules, the performance reviews, the scripted conversations, the annotated photos, everything. My hands shook, but I made sure each photo was clear and readable. While I was flipping through the back pages, I noticed a thumb drive clipped to the inside back cover, one of those tiny ones that's easy to miss. I unclipped it and put it in my pocket before my mother could react or object. My phone buzzed in my hand with a long text from Paula. I didn't read it right away, but I could see it was multiple paragraphs, way longer than her usual messages. After I finished photographing the last page, I opened the text and read through it while my mother sat there watching me. Paula wrote that she and the others had been trying to get out of their contracts for over a year. She explained how they'd told my mother repeatedly that they wanted to terminate the agreements and be real friends, but my mother threatened to sue them for breach of contract every single time. The text said my mother had leverage because she could ruin their acting careers if they broke the non-disclosure agreements or told me the truth. Paula wrote that they felt trapped between hurting me by lying and destroying their futures by telling the truth. I put the binder back in the drawer, pocketed my phone, and left the study without saying another word to my mother. She called after me, but I just kept walking down the stairs and out the front door. I got in my car and drove home in this weird fog where everything felt both too real and completely unreal at the same time. Once I was safely locked inside my apartment, I pulled out my laptop and searched for therapists who work with family problems and people who've been lied to by people they trust. The first website I found listed someone named Sabine Law who had availability later this week. I filled out the intake form right there, typing in all my information and a brief description of why I needed help, though I kept it vague because I didn't know how to explain the whole situation in a text box. The next morning, I woke up and couldn't fall back asleep because my brain wouldn't stop going over everything I'd discovered. I got up and started researching contract attorneys, looking for someone who dealt with weird employment situations or service agreements that seemed wrong. I found this lawyer named Raoul Howard, whose website mentioned experience with disputes over unusual contracts. I called his office as soon as they opened and explained briefly that I needed to understand some legal options for people trapped in contracts they wanted to escape. The person who answered scheduled me for a meeting later that week. On my lunch break, I looked up the address for Professional Friend Services LLC and drove to their office. It was in this generic business park with a bunch of other companies. Nothing that would make you think anything strange happened there. I walked into the reception area and it looked like any normal corporate office with motivational posters on the walls and a pleasant woman sitting at the front desk. Somehow that made the whole thing more disturbing, like they were hiding what they really did behind this boring professional appearance. I didn't talk to anyone, just looked around for a minute and left. Back at my desk, I drafted a formal email to the agency's general contact address, requesting all the data and files they had about me. I asked about their policies around client consent and whether they required permission from the actual person before accepting contracts from family members. I hit send and went back to work, though I couldn't focus on anything. Within an hour, I got a response from someone named Prudence Mays. The email was short and said they'd review my request and respond within 10 business days per their standard procedures. It felt like a stalling tactic, like they were buying time to figure out how to handle me now that I knew what they'd done. That evening, Paula texted asking if we could meet privately because she needed to talk to me face to face. I agreed even though I was still angry, because I needed to understand her side of this and see the actual contract with my own eyes. We met at a coffee shop way across town where neither of us would know anyone. She brought her laptop and pulled up the contract document, turning the screen so I could read it. The penalty clauses were right there in the terms. Specific dollar amounts she'd have to pay if she broke character or failed to meet the minimum weekly interaction requirements. There were sections about maintaining the fabricated backstory and consequences for revealing the true nature of the arrangement. I read through page after page of rules about how she was supposed to act around me, what she was allowed to say, how she had to report back to my mother about my emotional state and major life events. That evening back at my apartment, I pulled up my phone records online and opened the binder from my mother's study next to my laptop. I started with the timeline document that showed agency contact dates and matched them against my call history. The first major spike was right before my college graduation 5 years ago, when I'd felt so alone at the ceremony. My mother had called the agency 12 times in the week leading up to it. Then there was the cluster of calls right before my ex Blake broke up with me. 23 calls over 4 days. I scrolled through my entire phone history, and every significant moment had the same pattern. When I got promoted at work, agency calls spiked 2 days before Aubrey threw me that surprise celebration. When I was sick with the flu, multiple calls preceded Paula showing up with soup and staying the whole weekend. Even my birthday parties over 5 years showed coordination, with calls intensifying in the weeks before each one as my mother planned every detail with the agency. I made a spreadsheet documenting every correlation, and by midnight I had 47 instances where my mother's contact with the agency preceded what I'd thought were spontaneous acts of friendship. 3 days later, I drove to Sabine Law's office for my first therapy appointment. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The waiting room had those generic calming paintings and a white noise machine that didn't quite cover the sound of someone crying in another room. When Sabine called me in, she was younger than I expected, with dark hair pulled back, and an office that felt more like a living room than a medical space. I sat on her couch and tried to explain what happened, but the words came out jumbled and she handed me tissues before I realized I was crying. She asked me to start from the beginning, so I told her about finding the Venmo payments and discovering the contracts and learning my entire social life was manufactured. Sabine listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something that made my chest feel less tight. She told me what my mother did was called enmeshment, where a parent can't see their child as a separate person with their own life. She explained that my mother's help wasn't actually help, because real help builds someone's independence instead of taking it away. Within that first hour, Sabine was giving me words for things I'd felt but couldn't name, like how my mother's concern always came with control attached. The next day, I called my mother and she answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting. I didn't let her talk, just asked her directly about the memo I'd found in the files. The one from 3 years ago where she instructed the agency to have Aubrey discourage me from taking a job offer in Seattle. My mother went quiet for a long moment, then said Aubrey had just been helping me see the downsides of moving so far away. I told her that wasn't helping. That was manipulating me into staying close, so she could keep controlling my life. She started talking about how the Seattle job would have been bad for my career growth, and I was better off staying in my current position. I could hear it then, the way she wrapped control inside concern so smoothly I'd never noticed before. She genuinely believed she was protecting me from bad decisions instead of preventing me from making my own choices. I hung up without saying goodbye. The following morning, I drove back to the Professional Friend Services office and walked straight to the reception desk. I asked to speak with someone in leadership about the contracts involving me. The receptionist made a call, and 10 minutes later, a woman in her 50s came out and introduced herself as Prudence Mays. She had that corporate polish that made everything she said sound rehearsed. We sat in a small conference room, and I asked her directly if the contracts were legally binding. Prudence folded her hands on the table and said that all their contracts were enforceable legal agreements between the agency and the service providers. I asked if she thought it was ethical to accept money from someone's mother to manufacture their friendships without their knowledge. She said the agency operates within all applicable laws, and their clients' arrangements are confidential. When I pushed back, she just repeated that the contracts were binding and suggested I consult an attorney if I had concerns. 2 days later, I met with Raul Howard in his law office downtown. He was in his 40s with graying hair and an office cluttered with case files. I showed him all the photos I'd taken of the contracts and my mother's files. Raul spent 20 minutes reading through everything while I sat there trying not to fidget. Finally, he looked up and explained that I didn't have much legal recourse because I wasn't actually party to any of the contracts. The agreements were between my mother and the agency, and between the agency and the 4 women. But he said the women themselves might have grounds to challenge the contracts, especially the penalty clauses and the restrictions on terminating the agreements. He suggested trying to negotiate a mutual release where the women would be freed from their contracts in exchange for my agreement not to pursue any legal action against the agency. Over the next few days, my phone buzzed constantly with individual messages from Aubrey, Savannah, and Skylar. Aubrey sent a long text admitting that her whole struggling artist story was fake. She wrote that she actually came from a wealthy family in Connecticut and had never worried about money in her life. Savannah's message came next, confessing that the traumatic ex-boyfriend she'd cried about never existed. She'd fabricated the entire relationship and breakup story because the agency told her I'd relate better to someone who'd been hurt. Then Skylar sent a message that made me feel sick all over again. She wrote that even her engagement was fake, that her fiancé was another actor from a different agency, and their whole relationship was staged. I sat on my couch reading these revelations and feeling like I was learning who these people actually were for the first time. On Friday evening, I opened the group chat we'd maintained for 5 years. The last message was from Paula asking if I was okay. I scrolled up through thousands of messages, inside jokes, photos, plans, 5 years of daily contact that felt essential to my life. I clicked on the group settings and my finger hovered over the exit button. The moment I pressed it, I felt this rush of relief mixed with grief. So intense I had to put my phone down. The chat disappeared from my screen and I sat there in my quiet apartment realizing I had no one to text anymore. Monday morning at work, I was halfway through my coffee when I got a message from HR asking me to come to their office. My manager Karen was there with the HR director and they both looked uncomfortable. The director explained that my mother had emailed them over the weekend expressing wellness concerns about me. She'd written that I was going through a difficult time and might not be thinking clearly. I felt my face get hot as the director showed me the email on her computer screen. My mother had suggested the company should monitor my work performance and consider whether I needed a leave of absence. I told them my mother had no business contacting my workplace and explained briefly that we were having family issues. Karen looked relieved and said they just needed to follow up on any wellness concerns, but they had no intention of monitoring me differently. That afternoon, I went home and spent 3 hours systematically changing every password I had. Email, banking, social media, streaming services, everything. I removed myself from my mother's phone plan and set up a new account in just my name. While I was updating my phone settings, I found the location services section and saw that tracking was enabled. I clicked into the history and felt my stomach drop. There was an archived record going back years showing everywhere I'd been, every coffee shop, every friend's house, every late night at the office. My mother had been watching my movements this entire time. I disabled everything and then sat there staring at my phone, wondering what other access she had to my life that I didn't know about. The next morning at work, my coworker Mina stopped by my desk. We'd worked in the same department for 2 years, but never really talked beyond casual greetings and occasional work questions. She asked if I was okay because I seemed upset lately. I must have looked surprised because she smiled and said she didn't mean to pry, but she'd noticed I seemed stressed. Then she asked if I wanted to grab coffee after work. Nothing serious, just if I needed someone to talk to. I studied her face, trying to detect any sign that this was staged or paid for, but her expression was just genuinely concerned and a little uncertain, like she wasn't sure if she was overstepping. I heard myself say yes before I'd really decided, and we made plans to meet at the coffee shop down the block at 5:30. That evening, my phone buzzed with an email from Aubrey. The subject line just said, "You need to see this," and there was a PDF attachment. I opened it on my laptop and felt my hands go cold as I read the document. It was a memo dated 2 years ago with the Professional Friend Services logo at the top. The text was short and direct, instructing all 4 actors to discourage any friendship I might develop with a coworker named Mina Greco. The memo stated that organic relationships outside the managed circle posed risks to program effectiveness. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood what I was seeing. My mother had specifically targeted Mina before I even really knew her, just because we worked in the same department. I pulled up my email and wrote to Aubrey asking her to send me the complete file with all the metadata and timestamps still attached. She responded within 10 minutes with a larger file that included the full email headers. I opened it and saw my mother's email address right there in the sender information. The timestamp showed she had sent it on a Tuesday morning at 9:15, probably right after she got to her own office. The directives were clear and specific, telling the actors to isolate me from any genuine friendships that might form naturally. I saved the file to 3 different locations, and then just sat there staring at my screen. My second appointment with Sabine happened 2 days later. I brought printed copies of the memo and the timeline document from my mother's files. Sabine read through everything carefully, and then looked at me with this steady, calm expression. She started explaining what my mother had done using terms like isolation tactics and manufactured dependency. We spent the next 40 minutes working through exactly what those patterns looked like in my life. Sabine helped me write out clear boundary statements I could use when I was ready to confront my mother directly. We practiced saying them out loud until my voice stopped shaking. She gave me homework to document every instance of my mother trying to interfere or control something in my life over the next week. I left her office feeling like I finally had some tools, instead of just confusion and anger. I met with Raul the following afternoon at his law office downtown. He had reviewed all the documents I sent him, and had several file folders spread across his desk. He explained that he was drafting a formal proposal for releasing the 4 actors from their contracts. The terms included a requirement that the agency turn over all files and data they had collected about me. He walked me through each section of the proposal, making sure I understood what we were asking for and what leverage we actually had. Raul said he would send it to both my mother's attorney and directly to professional friend services by the end of the week. He also mentioned that we should expect resistance and be prepared to negotiate. I signed the authorization forms he needed and wrote him a check for his retainer fee. 3 days later, Raul forwarded me an email from my mother's lawyer. I opened it during my lunch break and had to read it twice to believe what I was seeing. The lawyer wrote that my mother would agree to release the actors from their contracts if I consented to working with a life coach she would select for me. The proposal included the name of someone my mother had already contacted and a suggested meeting schedule. I felt this surge of anger so strong I had to put my phone down and walk around the block twice. When I got back to my desk, I called Raul and told him absolutely not. I explained that this was just another attempt to control my life through a different paid professional. He agreed immediately and said he would send a response refusing the counterproposal. The next morning, I got a call from an unknown number while I was making coffee. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman introduced herself as Prudence from Professional Friend Services. Her voice was careful and professional as she told me she had concerns about potential reputational damage if this situation became public. She spoke in this measured way that made every word sound calculated. Prudence hinted that the agency might be willing to negotiate conditional releases for the actors if we could reach an understanding about confidentiality. I told her I would discuss it with my attorney and ended the call. My hands were shaking as I forwarded the call details to Raul. That afternoon, Paula texted asking if we could meet again. I agreed to coffee at a place near my apartment. When she arrived, she was carrying a small leather journal that looked worn and well used. She sat down across from me and pushed the journal toward me across the table. Paula explained that she had been keeping it for the past 3 years, writing about moments with me that mattered to her outside the contract requirements. She showed me entries about times when she forgot she was being paid and just enjoyed my company. There were pages about a road trip we took where we got lost and ended up laughing for hours. Notes about a night when we stayed up late talking about our dreams and fears. I didn't know what to say, so I just asked if I could take it home to read. She nodded and said I could keep it as long as I needed. I spent most of that night reading through Paula's journal entries. She had dated each one and included small details I had forgotten about. There was an entry about the day I got promoted at work, and we celebrated with cheap champagne in my apartment. Another about a morning when we met for breakfast before work, just because we both needed company. I recognized several of the moments she described, times that had felt genuinely unscripted even to me. The recognition created this confusing mix of feelings in my chest. It suggested that some authentic connection had existed within the manufactured framework, but I couldn't shake the question of whether I would ever be able to trust my own perception of what was real. I closed the journal around 2 in the morning and put it in my desk drawer. The coffee date with Mina happened on Saturday morning. We met at the place down the block from work and ordered our drinks. I decided to share a simplified version of what had happened, testing whether I could be vulnerable with someone outside the whole situation. I told her my mother had hired people to be my friends, and I had just found out recently. Mina listened without interrupting, and her face showed steady empathy that felt different from the practiced reactions I could now recognize. She asked a few gentle questions but didn't push, when I kept some details vague. When we finished our coffee, she said she was glad I told her, and that she understood if I needed to take things slow with new friendships. The conversation felt real in a way that made my chest hurt. I texted all 4 actors and arranged a meeting at a library study room near downtown. They showed up looking nervous and uncertain. I sat across the table from them and stated my terms for any future contact. I explained that I needed time and space to process everything. I told them I didn't want apologies right now because I wasn't ready to hear them. I said that any relationship we might build later would have to start completely from scratch with full honesty. Paula nodded and Aubrey wiped her eyes but stayed quiet. Savannah looked at the table and Skylar just said she understood. I stood up and left the room without looking back. In the library study room, I sat alone for a while and let myself feel the weight of what I had just done. The next morning, I called Sabine and asked if she could help set up the mediated conversation with my mother. She agreed and scheduled it for the following week at her office. The days leading up to that session felt heavy, and I kept my phone on silent to avoid any attempts from my mother to contact me directly. When the day arrived, I showed up 15 minutes early and sat in the waiting area trying to control my breathing. My mother walked in exactly on time, looking smaller than I remembered, her face showing the strain of the past weeks. Sabine brought us into her office and explained the ground rules for the conversation, emphasizing that this was about establishing clear boundaries and not about assigning blame or seeking immediate forgiveness. My mother sat across from me and started crying almost immediately, apologizing over and over until Sabine gently redirected her to focus on specific actions and commitments. The session lasted nearly 2 hours and covered everything from the agency arrangement to the tracking to the workplace interference. My mother admitted she had been terrified of losing me since I went away to college, and that her own childhood abandonment issues had driven her to control every aspect of my life. She agreed to all of Sabine's proposed boundaries, including no contact with my workplace, no tracking of my location through any means, and no hiring of any service providers to interact with me without my explicit written consent. I did not offer forgiveness because I was not ready for that yet, but I acknowledged out loud that she seemed willing to change, and that mattered to me. 2 days after the session, my mother showed up at Raoul's office with 3 large boxes and a hard drive containing all the files and documentation related to the agency arrangement. Raoul had me come in, and we went through everything together, while my mother sat quietly in the waiting area. The boxes contained printed contracts, payment records, performance reviews, behavioral reports, and personal notes my mother had kept about my life over 5 years. The hard drive had digital copies of everything, plus email correspondence between my mother and the agency spanning back to before the arrangement even started. Raoul prepared an affidavit stating that my mother confirmed this represented all data and documentation related to her monitoring of my life and the professional friend services arrangement, and she signed it without hesitation. I took the boxes and hard drive home and stored them in my closet, not ready to destroy them, but also not wanting to look through them again right away. That evening, I opened the group chat one final time and took screenshots of the entire conversation history before formally dissolving it. Then I sat down and wrote individual messages to each of the 4 women, establishing different boundaries based on my comfort level with each person. I told Savannah I needed complete no contact given her role in sending behavioral reports to my mother, and I asked her not to reach out to me in any form. For Paula, Aubrey, and Skylar, I left the door open for limited communication, if we both wanted that eventually, but I made it clear I needed significant time and space first. I sent all 4 messages within 10 minutes of each other, and then deleted their contact information from my phone. The next morning, I woke up to an email from Prudence at Professional Friend Services. She wrote in carefully professional language that the agency had implemented a new internal policy requiring documented consent from the actual client before accepting any family-initiated contracts for adult children. The policy change would not apply retroactively, but would prevent similar situations in the future. I read the email twice and felt a strange mix of emotions, like something small had shifted even though it could not undo what happened to me. Over the following weeks, I learned through occasional social media updates that Paula was auditioning for legitimate acting roles and had booked a small part in a local theater production. Aubrey had shifted to production work behind the camera and posted about working on an independent film project. Skylar was applying to graduate programs in social work and had written a personal essay about ethics in care professions. Their lives were moving forward separately from the manufactured friendships, and I felt a distant goodwill toward their progress without wanting to be part of it directly. Mina texted me asking if I wanted to meet for coffee again, and I agreed, suggesting the same place we went before. We met on Saturday morning, and I shared more complete details about what had happened with my mother and the agency arrangement. Mina listened without interrupting and asked thoughtful questions that showed she was trying to understand rather than judge. When I finished talking, she said something that stuck with me, that she wanted to be my friend. But she understood I needed to take things slow while processing everything, and she was okay with keeping things light and casual for as long as I needed. Her response felt respectful rather than distant, and I appreciated that she was not trying to rush into a deep friendship when I was clearly not ready for that. On Monday, I had a meeting with HR where I provided all the documentation of my mother's inappropriate contact with my manager. They reviewed everything carefully and told me they would add notes to my file blocking any future communication from her regarding my employment. The HR representative also confirmed that my mother's contact had violated company policies about third-party interference, and they would handle it internally. The workplace boundary felt secure now in a way it never was before, like I had finally protected one area of my life from her reach. That weekend, I spent both days systematically going through my apartment and removing items my mother had given me, or that were connected to her access to my life. I packed up decorative items she had bought, clothing she had picked out, and kitchen supplies she had insisted I needed. I updated all my emergency contacts to remove her as the primary person, and changed my mailing address for sensitive documents to a P.O. box she did not know about. I also drove to her house one last time to collect my remaining belongings from my old bedroom, filling 2 suitcases with things I actually wanted to keep. In my next therapy session with Sabine, we reached a milestone where I could clearly articulate my core values of authenticity and autonomy. I told her I was learning to tolerate the loneliness that came with having a smaller but genuine social circle, and that the discomfort of isolation felt more honest than the false comfort of manufactured connection. Sabine helped me see that rebuilding trust in my own judgment would take time, and that it was okay to move slowly in forming new relationships. 3 weeks after dissolving the group chat, I received a text from Paula asking if we could meet to talk about one specific memory from 3 years ago that she insisted was completely unscripted. I hesitated for 2 days before responding, but eventually agreed to meet her briefly at a neutral coffee shop. We sat across from each other, and she brought up the weekend we had spontaneously driven to the beach, getting lost on back roads and laughing about terrible gas station snacks and staying up late talking on the sand. As she described those moments, I found myself believing her that those particular interactions were real, that something genuine had existed even within the manufactured framework. We agreed to try building a very slow conditional friendship with complete honesty as the foundation, meeting maybe once a month with no expectations beyond that single interaction. 2 weeks later, my phone rang with my mother's number, and I let it go to voicemail twice before calling back. When she answered, I kept my notepad open with the script Sabine and I had practiced, reminding myself this was just about logistics. She needed my signature on some tax documents related to the agency payments, and I needed to handle it like an adult without getting pulled into emotional territory. We talked for maybe 4 minutes total, sticking to the facts about where to send the papers and when I could get them notarized. She didn't ask how I was doing or try to justify anything, and I didn't offer any personal information beyond confirming my current mailing address. When we hung up, I sat there feeling oddly calm instead of shaky, realizing that neutral contact was actually possible if we both followed the boundaries. The next afternoon, I met Raul at his office to sign the final paperwork closing my case. He showed me confirmation that my mother had paid the full contract termination fees to the agency, over $15,000 to release all 4 women from their agreements. I wrote him a check from my savings account for his bill, which came to $800, way less than I expected given how many hours he spent reviewing documents and drafting proposals. He shook my hand and told me I handled everything with impressive clarity, considering how messy the situation was, and I left his office feeling like I had actually protected myself through proper channels, instead of just reacting emotionally. That evening, I opened my laptop and started writing a letter I had no intention of sending anywhere. I addressed it to my 22-year-old self, the version of me who graduated college and moved to a new city, feeling completely alone and disconnected from everyone. I wrote about how the loneliness she felt was real and valid, but that manufactured comfort was worse than honest isolation. I explained that real friendships take time and involve risk, and sometimes mean sitting with discomfort instead of accepting easy solutions. I told her that our mother's fear of losing us would drive her to controlling behavior, but that it wasn't our job to manage her anxiety. I wrote for almost 2 hours, filling 4 pages with everything I wished I could go back and tell that scared, lonely version of myself. When I finished, I folded the letter and put it in an envelope that I tucked into my desk drawer, not for anyone else to read, but just as a way of acknowledging that younger self and letting her go. The following weekend, I deliberately made no plans at all, wanting to see what it felt like to choose solitude instead of having it forced on me. I slept late on Saturday and spent the afternoon reading a book I had bought months ago but never opened. I cooked an elaborate dinner just for myself, trying a new recipe that took over an hour to prepare, and I ate it slowly at my kitchen table without turning on the TV or scrolling through my phone. On Sunday morning, I sent Mina a casual text asking if she wanted to grab brunch the following week, and when I hit send, I noticed I felt okay whether she said yes or no. The invitation was genuine but not desperate, and I could handle either response without it meaning anything about my worth. On Monday, a Venmo notification popped up on my phone showing a payment from Paula for $2,500 with a note that just said, "Final month." Should have never accepted it. I stared at the amount knowing my mother had already paid her, but that Paula wanted to return it anyway once everything came out. I transferred the money that same day to a nonprofit I found online that helps young adults transitioning out of controlling family situations, keeping the donation anonymous because I didn't need recognition or a tax write-off. A few days later, I opened my email and saw a message from my mother with the subject line, "Update, no response needed." Inside, she wrote 3 sentences explaining that she started seeing a therapist who specializes in anxious attachment and controlling behaviors, that she was doing this work for herself, and that she understood I might not want to know, but she was sharing it anyway. The email didn't ask for my approval or try to guilt me into responding, and I appreciated that she was finally taking action without making it about getting something from me. I saved the email in a folder without replying, letting it exist as information rather than an opening for renewed contact. That weekend, I pulled out old photo albums and scrolled through 5 years of digital pictures, making deliberate choices about what to keep. I archived most of them into a folder I rarely opened, but I kept a few specific images that represented moments I decided to claim as meaningful, regardless of how they came about. There was a photo from the beach trip with Paula that we had talked about during our recent coffee meeting, and another from my birthday 2 years ago, where I was genuinely laughing at something Aubrey said. I couldn't erase the context, but I could choose to own the memories as part of my story, instead of letting them be completely contaminated by the betrayal. Late one evening, I created a throwaway account on a support forum, and wrote an anonymous post about my experience with manufactured friendships and family interference. I kept all the details vague, changing names and locations and specific circumstances, but I told the core story honestly without making myself a victim, or my mother a villain. Sharing it felt like releasing something I had been carrying alone, and after I posted it, I closed the browser without checking for responses, or waiting for validation. The story existed now outside of just my own head, and that was enough. On a sunny Sunday morning, 3 weeks after our last conversation, I picked up my phone and texted Mina asking if she wanted to grab brunch. She responded within 10 minutes with an enthusiastic yes, and a suggestion for a place near both our apartments. I felt something quiet and hopeful reading her response, not the manufactured excitement of my old friendships, but something more solid and real. I was building something genuine now, One honest interaction at a time, and even though it was slower and scarier than the version my mother had constructed, it was actually mine. That's today's story finished up. I'm grateful you were here, because these moments feel brighter when they're shared. Hopefully it left you smiling just a little. Subscribe if you'd like to keep sharing more of these with me.